So getting into typography, there's a ton of terminology associated with typography. I'm not going to go over all of it. It's not necessarily a requirement of the assignment, but you'll hear some terms that you're familiar with, some that you might not be familiar with. I'm not going to go over all of these here, but things like a serif. We've talked about serif versus sans serif fonts. So basically the serif would be this little tail kind of thing, these extra little formations here. In letters like Y, like for this example, or sometimes capital A's, M's, W's, etc. You have the crotch of the letter, you have your cap height, you have a descender with lowercase letters that come below the baseline. You have an ascender, which I don't think they have an example of here, but you have an ascender, which is basically above, generally above the top line or the cap height of letters. Like oftentimes lowercase h's, not in this case, but lowercase h's or lowercase l's will extend beyond the cap height. It just depends on how a font is designed. When we talk about font design, generally the shape and the attributes of a letter, or how a letter is constructed, or a character, I should say, because we can talk about special characters, numbers, etc., are all called glyphs. Why, I honestly don't know, but when you actually talk about a character and the sort of styling of the character, you talk about the glyph. So like the shape of the glyph, etc., and all these different things. How you use a font and your font choices, I think as far as sort of we in the general sense, as designers are concerned, like obviously it's something that we take into high consideration. It's something that non-designers or people that don't generally think about it very much, non-artists potentially don't necessarily think about a whole lot, is that like how you display something, which font you choose can have an attitude or a feeling or something associated with it. So like this example here, so if we switched these two examples, right, these two statements, obviously they would have very, very different feelings, right? So if we used a big, bold font for this I love you, it would have a little bit of a different attitude than with this sort of like thinner, more elegant font, right? Or if we had a thinner, more elegant font for the statement I hate you, it would potentially have less power or less meaning or something like that, you know, literally be less heavy, right? Serif versus sans serif fonts, again, we talked about it a little bit. You can see in the example here, a serifed font is basically any font that has these little tails at the ends of some letters, versus a sans serif font. You can see the difference in the S's. They're more block-like, and they don't have that little extra additional elements at the edges of the glyphs. There's generally 5 typefaces or key typefaces: geometric, humanist, old style, transitional. I always want to say traditional. Transitional, modern, and slab serif. They relate to each other in various different ways. I'm not going to go over every single word here, but geometric fonts are generally sans serif fonts. They can be serifed fonts, but they're generally sans serif. So for this example, we're using the font Futura. And basically geometric fonts are based on strict geometric forms. So you can see in this grid example, we have essentially our perfect circle. Even though it's a G, very symmetrical, how it fills the space. The E the same way. The spacing is a little off because of the kerning, but you get the idea. The E fills up these 4 squares. The O is perfectly symmetrical, things like that. So they're basically based on geometric forms, right? Humanist sans serif fonts are very similar to geometric fonts, but they have some human characteristics, like they might have like some variation in the bowl of a letter. Obviously, they're not perfectly symmetrical. They are derived a little bit from handwriting, so they essentially have a little bit more personality. They're sans serif fonts that have like slightly more personality and are not necessarily sort of like mathematically even, if that makes sense. Old style typefaces are generally based on historical development, based on calligraphy. They tend to be serifed. Sometimes they can be mixed. They can be sans serif fonts. but often they're serif fonts. But they're basically based off of engravings and calligraphy, things like that. So they're sometimes in the middle between a sans serif and a serif font. But you can see again, there's a little bit of variation between thick and thin, with the belly of this D and the O, where you can see some variations in thick and thin. Again, sort of more classical, more sort of traditional looking. Transitional and modern are basically based on experimenting with letter forms that were sort of in between the sans serif, serif font, and the transitional versus geometric, right? So basically, you'll see some more variation. Again, you can see in this capital M. This is a little bit more of a modern style in this case, where you can see like these are more curved is not a great term, but there is variation between thick and thin lines. There's less variation between thick and thin lines. But you can see again more sort of like softer corners, things like that with a transitional font, whereas with a modern font, there's still the variation between thick and thin, but they're less sort of soft. They're a little bit more geometric, if that makes sense. And then we have slab serif, which are exactly like it sounds. They're a serifed font. They're kind of in between a serif and a sans serif, but they're basically chunkier serif fonts. A lot of times these fall in a category of display fonts. Usually have serif, sans serif, and display. Display fonts often are those fonts that are based on signatures or like distressed fonts. Like it's sort of going out of trend now, but that's like was a huge trend, was distressed everything, vintage everything. So those distressed fonts that don't necessarily fit into a category are display fonts. Often slab serif fonts fall into that category, mainly because of how the glyphs interact. So you have like here, you have this odd interaction of negative space, where we'll get into it later, but your kerning is tricky here, and it almost makes this odd sort of negative space. And even here with this R and the I, the negative space could potentially present some design problems, which is why they kind of stick in that display category. If you're going to use multiple fonts, we'll get into this in more detail in a little bit, but when you're using multiple fonts, you want to use, if you're using two, for example, you want to use two very distinctive fonts, right? You don't want to pick, like if you're going to change, these are two different fonts, right? But they barely look like it, right? If you show a non-designer or somebody that doesn't really care, like they're not really going to notice a difference between these two fonts, right? So if you do make a change in font, make a big change, right? Either enlarge or make a huge change, right? So the contrast in size, weight, style, a serif font here versus a sans serif font. Again, Helvetica versus Franklin Gothic, or even Helvetica and Arial are two sort of more commonly used fonts. Really the visual differences between like Helvetica and Arial to a non-type designer is super minimal, and you might as well not even make that change, right? So if you're going to make a change, or if you're going to use different fonts, use different fonts, right? We'll get into that a little bit more specifically. Here's an example of sort of cleaning up design, right? I'm sure we've all seen this, and I've got more examples, but a not so great visual use of display fonts. So like this font, I don't know what it is, but this font here would be a display font because it doesn't it's technically a serifed font, but it's very stylized. The glyphs are super stylized. So that would be more display. But you can see the example on the left, the important information is really hard to read. It's a little bit pixelated, but it's super hard to read, right? So you have this line, their open hours, and they accept credit cards, some of their prices, you know, like obviously we sort of know, but is this a 3? Is that a 5? Is that, so you don't want to use super stylized fonts for like very important information if it's smaller, right? None of these are really hard and fast rules, but in general, if this was a 8.5 by 11 menu, right? The one on the right reads way better. They're more stylized font for the name of the restaurant and the categories, which is fine. But you can see how this line, even as it's pixelated, reads much better. The descriptions of what you can order and the prices read way better. So legibility, visual legibility is super important when choosing a font, right? Number of fonts to use in a design. With all of these, and again, I say sort of generally because they're not super hard and fast rules, but if this were an invitation for something, or if you saw this somewhere, it's super visually not legible. It's not very reader friendly. Way too many fonts in this on purpose. And this also speaks a little bit to hierarchy, which we'll get a little bit later. But using the same exact information and two different fonts, one that's a little bit more stylized for effectively a title, and then one that's a little bit less stylized, but still has some personality for the information. So we have the who, what, when, why, where, all that good stuff. But really, just using different sizes of this font, and then here at the bottom, some color differences rather, just to separate some of the specifics of the event. You can have, I mean, obviously there's more graphics and things, like this one was done super ugly on purpose, but again, you can see with like minimal design, and even if this was just a white background with this, obviously it's way better than the first one, right? Less fonts, less clunky, way easier to read. You start working with a hierarchy. Making some relatively minimal changes can make a significant difference, right? Length of text lines, generally, and this is all, again, sort of based on like a 12-point font, like a book or a magazine or something like that. But generally, you don't really want to have more than 50 or 60 characters per line. When you have a giant block of text, like if you were to have a magazine and one page would be a full page of text, you generally don't want to have one giant block of text, right? Because that's going to be really hard for your readers to actually read. It's too unruly, and most people aren't really going to bother. You would want to break that up into columns. Those of you that have taken InDesign have had experience with this, but generally you want to have columns. So even a full page of text in a magazine that's broken up into 2 or 3 columns reads way easier than one giant block of text, right? Leading, I think I brought this up in this class before, maybe not, but basically leading is effectively your line spacing. It's technically different, but it's effectively your line spacing. So here we can see this block of text. There's not enough leading, so we can see with this ascender and descender, they're crashing into each other. Although this is dummy text, I get, but again, we have some intrusion with ascenders and descenders. It basically it's really hard to read when, again, you have this sort of giant block of text and then the leading is too tight. As a general rule, you want your leading to be about 2 more point sizes than your text, right? So if this is 17-point font, you want your leading to be 19 points. So this way now you have baseline to baseline. You have some nice space to not worry about rather your ascenders and descenders coming together, like in this case here. It looks way better, and it's just way easier to read, right? Sometimes you would use less, sometimes you would use more. It just depends on your font. It depends on your size, etc. If you have a really small font, sometimes increasing the leading a little bit more makes it a little bit more legible, things like that. So again, not hard and fast rules, but it's just general rule of thumb, 2 spaces or 2 points larger than your text size. Tracking and kerning. Tracking is, I should have started with kerning, but tracking is the overall space between multiple characters, right? Between a group of letters. So it's 3 or more. And you can adjust your tracking across an entire word or set of words, etc. Kerning is the actual space in between each glyph, right? And that's going to vary, right? Kerning, I feel, especially as like a font nerd, kerning is a very, very often overlooked and undervalued skill to have. It's not exactly exciting, adjusting space between letters, but having something that's really well kerned, especially with a logo or flyer, etc., can really make a huge difference with reading. I have some examples, albeit very inappropriate, but I have some examples, but I'll talk about an example. There was recently on Facebook, I think it was Uno locally, had like some kind of Sunday football offer or whatever, pizza and this and whatever, blah, blah, blah. But they called it their Blitz package. And the font that they used was like this brush strokey kind of cool font and whatever. And the kerning was really, really tight. And the L and the I joined together. So it looked like it said Butts package. Obviously, you don't kind of want that. That's a little bit silly. But a good example of how bad kerning can ruin a design, right? And of course, it was immediately called out on Facebook, and they changed it very, very quickly. This is another sort of cheesy font nerd joke with it, but kemming is the result of improper kerning. So you can see here, this is the same font. This should be an R and an N. But as you see, as these 2 points of this glyph come too close together, they can join and form an M effectively, right? So these are the very inappropriate examples of actual poor kerning in use. These are legit businesses and legit examples. Yeah, not good, right? So this one I actually saw at Lowe's or Home Depot, I think, because it's orange. Yeah, not good.